This week we're going to be looking at 3 letters that Paul wrote, 2 letters to churches and 1 letter to a person. This will be the first time we dealt with a personal letter from Paul written by him to an individual. The other 2 is going to be 1 Thessalonians and Philippians. The personal letter is the letter to Philemon. We've been talking a little bit. I've talked about 1 Thessalonians quite a bit. This week we're going to go straight into it and deal with that letter specifically. Both 1 Thessalonians and Philippians tend to be much nicer letters. We'll talk about Philippians a little bit later in another seminar. But Thessalonians is really kind from the beginning to the end. It's very dissimilar to 1st and 2nd Corinthians in that regard. But he's dealing with a very pastoral issue in 1 Thessalonians. Philippians is written to the church at Philippi. We don't know a lot about that church from Paul's perspective, but when we get into Philippians, we'll talk about that. Philemon's a fascinating letter that should really be important to us in the kind of work that many of you do in ministry. Philemon will be interesting to deal with because of the issue in that letter itself. So enjoy these lectures, and if you have any questions or comments, just send me an email. Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians is Paul's first letter ever. It is instrumental in the New Testament for understanding Paul's writings, the way he writes, how he addresses issues, and we learn a lot about how Paul functioned in these early churches that he started. 1 Thessalonians and because it's Paul's first letter, we believe that 1 Thessalonians most likely is the first letter ever written in the New Testament. Therefore, it's the first writing of the New Testament, most likely written in the year 49. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But Thessalonica was a major city. It was on the Egnatian Way, which connected Rome to the east as a road. Roman technology paved that road. So the technology of travel was unprecedented during the Roman period, and Thessalonica was on that trade route. If you look at that map that is here, you can see where Thessalonica is and its proximity to Philippi. We'll talk about the letter to the Philippians in the next lecture. But you see how close Thessalonica is to Philippi. Philippi is just to the east. And you'll see Egnatian Way is that dotted line connecting the two. Thessalonica is also a port city, so there was a lot of trade coming in and out of Thessalonica, and it is the capital of the Roman province of Macedonia, which was a major province for the Roman Empire. You look just south, you'll see Corinth and Achaia. This is where Paul started another church. So you can see Paul's travels. He started the church in Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth. Just to the east of this map would be Asia Minor, where Ephesus and Miletus and some other major cities are for Paul's ministry. But Thessalonica is a very important city. It's not quite as big as Corinth. Corinth had 2 ports, but still it is a major city and very important for trade, which is one of the reasons Paul goes to start this church. So let's look at Paul's pattern of ministry according to his own writings. What he would do was arrive in a city, and this is in his own words. So the way Paul talks about how he would set up ministry is very different than the way the Acts of the Apostles talks about Paul's pattern. So Paul would arrive in a city. He would start a local business. And most likely this is a business related to leather goods. In Acts, he's talked about as a tent maker. And what that most likely means is that tents were made out of leather in the Greco-Roman period. Very few textiles were used for that kind of tent. So the word leather maker is what they translate or understand as tent maker. But we don't really know for sure. Paul is definitely in the leather business at some sort. And he would set up these businesses right in the middle of town where people could rent spaces for businesses and then have a room upstairs in that space. So it was a very public space for him to work. And in that public space, this is where Paul would share the story of Jesus, his gospel, with local Gentiles. These were non-Jews. So there certainly were pockets of Jews in these cities, specifically Thessalonica, Philippi, Corinth, and some of these other major cities where Paul started churches. But Paul never says he goes to the synagogue to start a church. He always considers himself an apostle to the Gentiles, and the word apostle means sent. So his self-understanding is one who's sent to the Gentiles to spread this good news. And what was the nature of Paul's message? The first thing he would do is talk about one God, and that God was the God of Israel. So in these Gentile spaces that were utterly polytheistic, Paul would speak of the one God of Judaism, and this is the founding principles of Judaism. Deuteronomy 6:4, or the Shema, is Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So this is the beginning of Paul's gospel, is always a conviction that there is only one God. And the next step was that Jesus was God's son. And so this is where Paul begins to innovate in Jewish understanding of God and who the Messiah is. So Jesus was the son of that one God. Jesus died and was raised from the dead for people's sins, and for Jesus will come again to judge the world. This is the full content of Paul's gospel. This is what he would have preached in 1 Thessalonians. We'll see that this is what he preached to the Thessalonians initially. It's recorded there in that letter. And this is kind of the nature of Paul's gospel throughout his ministry. What gets him in trouble among Jews is the fact that there is no word in this message of Gentiles having to become Jewish. And this is, like we've already said, the most contentious issue, one of the most contentious issues in the early Jesus movement. Paul feels no need for Gentiles to convert to Judaism in order to believe in Jesus. So that first step is problematic in that gospel, the conviction that there is one God, and preaching that one God to Gentiles. In most cases, Orthodox Judaism, or the Judaism of Paul's time, would say, yes, they have to believe in one God. And in order to believe in that one God, there are certain rules you have to live by. And it's those rules that Paul fundamentally disagrees with his Jewish brothers and sisters regarding Gentile circumcision, food laws, and other things. So this is a big contention in Paul's gospel. This is not an issue to the people or the believers in Thessalonica, but this is the pattern of Paul's ministry. So then he begins meeting with local converts. So once there were enough people who have converted from polytheism into monotheism, and in that monotheism they believed that Jesus died for their sins and was raised on the third day and was going to come back to judge the world, these local converts would begin to gather together in a home. And this is indicative of the fact that there were people in this movement who had a space for them to meet. So there tends to be someone in this community who has the means to host these meetings. Most of them were probably poorer, but there was a cross section, and it's that cross section of economic livelihood that causes some problems in Corinth. We don't see that problem so much in Thessalonica, but this is because of Paul's pattern of ministry. This is some of the reasons why there's a problem. Now, Paul never talks about preaching on the street corners. Now, that was something that was common in Paul's time. Certain kind of philosophers would do that. Paul never says that he preaches on the street. And he also never says that he goes to the local synagogue. So Paul's pattern does not include street preaching or the local synagogue. There is a section in Acts that indicates that Paul did some preaching on the street, but Paul never says he does that. According to Paul's own words, this was not a part of his ministry, and neither was going to the local synagogue. This is some of the places where Paul, in his own writings, differs from Luke in Acts. So let's look at Paul and the Thessalonian church. Here it's really interesting. This is modern day Thessaloniki in Greece. It's still in the same place, and you'll see the modern buildings in the background. Those are the ancient Roman ruins of their forum that was during Paul's time that they're kind of unearthing. That's pretty fascinating. So if we look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9 through 10, we hear Paul's original message. Here he says, "You turn to God from idols." So this is the conversion from polytheism to monotheism, and in order to serve a living and true God. In other words, Paul preached that the one God was the God of Israel, and that was the God they had to serve, and to wait for his Son from heaven. So here you already have built in this concept that Jesus is God's Son, and that Jesus would return at the end of the age with judgment, and whom he raised from the dead. Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath that is coming. So there's a conviction here within this statement that Jesus had been killed and that he had been raised from the dead and that he would come again to judge the world. This is Paul's message. It is thoroughly apocalyptic. It's clear that Paul understood the whole Jesus movement as an apocalyptic movement that would culminate in his own lifetime. And we'll read this a little bit later in 1 Thessalonians. There's no evidence of a hostile relationship in this letter. It looks like Paul and the Thessalonians were good friends. This would be considered a friendship letter that he writes to them. And he started this church with two other men, Timothy and Silvanus. These two were with him, maybe worked with him in his leather shop. We don't really know, but they were definitely two men who were with him when they started this church. And then he left Thessalonica for Athens, and it was probably in Athens that he began to worry about the church, and so he sent Timothy back and to check on the church. And you'll see this in chapter 3, verse 1 when you read through it. And so Timothy goes and returns to Paul and reports to Paul both the good news of the faith of the Thessalonians. I mean, this is definitely a good report. Timothy talks about how faithful they're being and that their faith is being, everybody knows about their faith. But he does report to Paul that they have a question about the end time. And so Paul writes 1 Thessalonians in response to Timothy's report in the year 49. So that's the history of Paul and this church in Thessalonica is a little bit different than in Corinth, mainly because we only have this letter that helps us kind of understand Paul's relationship to that church. So it's much shorter than 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And so we just don't have that much additional information. outside of what we have in First Thessalonians. And this is what we can understand happened. Paul preached this message. It's a very apocalyptic message. He had a good relationship with these folks. He started the church with Silvanus and Timothy. Not long after he started it, he moved to Athens, probably set up shop in the same kind of pattern of ministry that he set up shop in Thessalonica. He sent Timothy back to check on them. Timothy gets there and returns to Paul with good news about their faith, but also a question that they have about the end times. It's in relation to that Paul writes 1 Thessalonians in the year 49. So let's look at the outline to the letter. Salutation is a typical salutation in chapter 1, verse 1. But what makes 1 Thessalonians unique in all of Paul's writings is this extended thanksgiving. He spends all of chapter 1, 2, and 3 in this extended thanksgiving. The first section, verses 2 through 10 of chapter 1, he talks about the Thessalonians' faith as exemplar. This is probably what he heard from Timothy that was such good news. Chapter 2, 1 through 16, Paul talks about him coming to them and how he initially came to them and ministered among the Thessalonians. In the second half of that chapter, Paul talks about his desire to return, which prompted him sending Timothy. And then finally, chapter 3, 6 through 13 is Timothy's report that Paul received. So this is just a large section of extended thanksgiving. And then we finally get to the body of the letter, which is chapter 4, verse 1 through 5:11. But you'll notice that the thanksgiving is longer than the actual body of the letter. So you can tell Paul had a lot to say of thanksgiving to him. The first part of chapter 4 is moral exhortation. We don't know if there was anything going on. This looks like kind of stereotypical moral exhortation. We don't think that there's any problem happening in First Thessalonians or in the church at Thessalonica. This is just information that Paul's given to morally encourage them. And then chapter 4, 13 through 5:11. This is really the reason why Paul wrote the letter and his teaching regarding the Lord's return. We'll get into that a little bit more a little bit later, but this is the specific issue that prompted Paul to write the letter. And then in chapter 5, verses 12 through 28, you get the conclusion of the letter, the closing of the letter. So here's the major issue addressed. Here is Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. If you ever get to go to Rome, go see this. This is also the same roof that has the creation picture with Adam and God touching Adam and giving him life. So it's pretty, it's just beautiful, but it's just kind of Michelangelo's understanding of the Last Judgment in art. So the major issue addressed by Paul is Paul's teaching on Jesus' return. We learned earlier that Paul's gospel was an apocalyptic gospel, that Jesus would come in wrath at the end of the age. And this is kind of the power of God, Paul's gospel. I mean, death and resurrection of Jesus for sure, but this idea that Jesus would return and judge and condemn the world and save all those who believed in him was a key component of Paul's gospel. And even when he wrote 1 Thessalonians in the year 49, Paul believed this would happen, that Jesus would return in his own lifetime. And here you see chapter 4:15, Paul says, "We who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord." And then in verse 17 he says, "We who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever." With them is exactly why Paul wrote this letter. So it looks like some believers had passed away in verse 13 of chapter 4. And the ones who were left behind, who were still alive, had questions about who have died. Where are they? Will they participate in the Lord's return? Um, and so they were convinced that Jesus would come back because this is the nature of Paul's gospel. And Paul believed that Jesus would come back in his own lifetime. But what happens in the meantime? I mean, what happens when you have people dying in your congregation and Jesus hasn't returned when you were convinced that Jesus would return before anybody died? So this question about the end time is what prompted Paul to write the First Thessalonians. And Paul basically says, when the end of time comes and Jesus returns, the dead will rise first. And then all who are left, and Paul believed if he would be around, would be caught up in the air with them. Now, the obvious issue for modern readers is the fact that Jesus hasn't returned yet, and it's been 2,000 years. So there's a theological question that we have to deal with about the return of Christ. Should we just kind of not believe in it anymore because it's been 2,000 years and it's obvious that Paul thought it would happen in his lifetime? Or do we reinterpret that and cast it further into the future? What do we do with this kind of key conception in Paul's gospel? That's left for us to deal with, and we all have to deal with it in our own context. But this is the reason why the first letter in the New Testament was written. The first writing of the New Testament started because of this issue.